Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we are putting poetry itself on the stand. We're going to dive into a brilliant 400-year-old argument about why stories matter and why our imagination might be one of the most powerful tools we have.
So, this whole thing boils down to a question we still argue about today. Is fiction just a bit of fun, a harmless escape, or is it something more dangerous? A lie that fills our heads with nonsense and maybe even makes us worse people? Well, this was a huge debate back in Elizabethan England, and the answer one man came up with would change literature forever. To get what's going on, you first have to meet the man defending poetry. And he was, without a doubt, one of the most incredible people of his time, Sir Philip Sidney. This guy wasn't just some writer in a dusty room, he was the living, breathing ideal of a Renaissance man. I mean, just look at this guy's resume. He was a famous poet, sure, but he was also a decorated soldier who literally died in battle. He was a brilliant scholar and a major player in Queen Elizabeth's court. He was a man of action and a man of letters, which, made him the absolute perfect person to step up and defend the arts. Okay, so here's where the drama really starts. In 1579, a Puritan writer named Stephen Godson publishes this furious takedown of all art, especially poetry and plays, called The School of Abuse. And then, in a move that was frankly just jaw-dropping, he dedicates it to Sir Philip Sidney, the most famous art supporter in all of England. It was a total power move, a public challenge that Sidney just couldn't ignore. So, yeah, this dedication basically put all of poetry on trial. And Sidney was kind of forced to be its defense attorney. So let's look at the case against it. Gosson and the other poet haters, as Sidney called them, had four main charges they were ready to throw at storytelling. And you gotta admit, these arguments packed a punch. First, poetry is a total waste of time, a distraction from, important stuff. Second, it's the mother of lies. I mean, it's fiction, right? It's not true. Third, it's the nurse of abuse, getting us all emotional and encouraging bad behavior. And the final blow, the real kicker? Even the great philosopher Plato wanted to kick poets out of his ideal society. Oof, how do you even begin to argue against that? Well, Sidney's response was a masterpiece called An Apology for Poetry. And get this, he doesn't just play defense, batting away the charges. No, he goes on the attack, arguing that poetry isn't just not bad, it's actually the most important, the most valuable way to make us better people. And this, right here, is the heart of his whole argument. Sidney comes up with this absolutely brilliant idea that a good story is actually a better teacher of what's right and wrong than either history or philosophy, which back then were, the two most respected subjects you could study. Let's break this down, because it's so cool. So on one side, you've got the philosopher. They teach you about virtue with a bunch of abstract rules and what Sidney called dry, wordish descriptions. Then you have the historian, who gives you real examples, but they're stuck with what actually happened, the messy, real world where, let's be honest, the bad guys often win. But the poet? Sidney says the poet gets the best of both. They can take the philosopher's lesson and combine it with the historian's vivid example to create a perfect story that makes being good actually seem cool. And this brings us to one of his most famous lines. He says, "Poetry is a speaking picture, and its whole point is to teach and delight." Think about it. A story doesn't just tell you to be brave. It shows you a hero being brave. It turns an abstract idea into a picture in your mind, something that's not just a lesson, but is also exciting and fun. I absolutely love this metaphor he uses. Sidney says learning about virtue from a philosopher is like taking gross, bitter medicine. You do it because you have to, but learning it from a poet, that's like taking a medicine of cherries. The important lesson is wrapped up in something so sweet and enjoyable that you just absorb it without even trying. The fun part makes you want to be a good person. Okay, but what about that huge charge, right? That poets are just liars? This is where Sidney gets really clever. He basically says the poet is the least likely person to be a liar. Why? Well, a historian or a philosopher claims what they're saying is the literal truth. But the poet never affirmeth. They never claim the story is real. They're openly telling you, hey, this is made up. And as Sidney points out, if you never claim to be telling the truth, you can never tell a lie. It's genius. And all of this builds up to what I think is Sidney's most powerful, most inspiring idea. The job of an artist isn't just to copy the world we see, but to actually create a better one. You see, for the ancient Greeks, art was about imitation, just holding up a mirror to nature. But Sidney completely redefines this. He says it's not about just copying what's already there, it's a creative imitation. The poet looks at our flawed, messy world and uses their imagination to show us a version of what it could be. So Sidney basically lays out these two worlds for us. On one side, you have the brazen world. That's our world, the real world. It's often dull, unfair, and kind of ugly. But then there's the golden world that the poet creates. In that world, heroes are inspiring, good always triumphs, and virtue is rewarded. And for Sidney, this golden world isn't just some fantasy escape. It's an inspiration. It's a model designed to make us want to go out and make our own brazen world just a little bit more golden. So, why are we talking about this today? Why does it still matter? Because this wasn't just some old-school academic squabble. What Sidney did here laid the groundwork for how we value fiction even now, and his ideas are, frankly, more relevant than ever. And, the impact was immediate. William Shakespeare himself was so influenced by Sidney's circle that he borrowed a major plot line for King Lear straight out of Sidney's story, Arcadia. And just think about our debates today. Every time we argue about whether violent movies cause real violence or whether fantasy is just pointless escapism, we are having the exact same fight Sidney was having 400 years ago. We're still trying to figure out how stories shape who we are.
So in the end, what this is all about is a defense of the human imagination itself. Sidney argues that the greatest power of art isn't just to show us the world as it is, but to show us the world as it ought to be. It gives us those golden worlds that we need to even imagine a better future. And, that leaves us with a pretty big question for our own time. In a world with so many complex problems, what golden worlds do we need our storytellers to create for us today?